And now, a passage from The Territory of Colorado by Frederic L. Paxson. It is commonly taken for granted that the Kansas-Nebraska legislation of 1854 settled the territorial question in the United States, and that the territorial question itself was only a single phase of the larger question of slavery. The tyranny of the slavery problem over the historical mind has completely subordinated the problem of the expansion of the agricultural West, the settlement of new areas, and the providing of adequate institutions of government for the citizens of the frontier. The erection of the Territory of Colorado in 1861 is itself proof that slavery was not in its own day destructive of interest in all other topics. However, it may have impeded their consideration and is an illuminative precedent in showing the manner in which territorial problems have been forced upon Congress and ultimately adjusted. The acquisition of the Southwest at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 extended the legal frontier of the United States far beyond the frontier of actual settlement and compelled Congress to give serious thought to the subdivision of large and relatively uninhabited areas of public lands. The Act of May 30th, 1854, which has commonly been misunderstood as saying the last important word upon the territorial question, merely marked the end of the earliest period of preliminary adjustment. The residuum of the Louisiana Purchase and the lands acquired through the Mexican War were at last distributed among two states, California and Texas, and 4 territories. The 2 territorial organizations of New Mexico and Utah covered the whole area between California and the Rocky Mountains, while the 40th parallel divided most of the unorganized area east of the mountains into Kansas and Nebraska territories. The distribution in effect at the end of the session of 1854 was only preliminary, and within 3 years Congress had begun to consider the division of 3 of these territories, Nebraska, Utah, and New Mexico, whose gigantic size precluded the rigorous execution of law by single territorial establishments. In the first session of the 35th Congress, 1857 to 1858, it was finally proposed to divide 2 of these territories, creating Arizona in the western end of New Mexico and Nevada in the western end of Utah, while the next session brought a bill to erect Dakota in the northern end of Nebraska. The division was required by various facts of population and migration, the location of the great Pacific trails, the discovery of silver mines, the willingness to restrict the territory of the Mormons, all appear as inspiring a further subdivision of the scantily populated West. The Congress of 1857 to 1858 passed no laws for the erection of new territories in the areas marked out in the debates. There is some internal evidence throughout these and later debates that the young sponsors of the new Republican Party were interested in territorial development as a means of continuing the anti-slavery argument, which all parties had agreed in 1854 to forget. But whatever may have been the motives underlying the agitation, the arguments make entirely clear the facts that the boundaries of 1854 were only temporary, and that the great shapeless territories must someday be divided. The session of 1857 to 1858 contented itself with the suggestion of 2 new territories of Nevada and Arizona. When the same Congress met for its second session in 1858 to 1859, 2 more new territorial projects, those of Dakota and Jefferson, had been added to its list. In the migrations to the far west beginning to be heavy in the 40s, the 2 principal routes had branched from the Missouri River near its northern bend on the western boundary of the state of Missouri. From this point, the northern or Oregon route had run westwardly along the Platte, the southern or Santa Fe route along the Arkansas. And at the 102nd meridian, the 2 trails were already 250 miles apart, and were deviating still further to the northwest and southwest, respectively. The angle between the trails covered the heart of the Great American Desert, which Major Long had described in 1820 as utterly uninhabitable for man, and which men had since 1820 been willing to take at the word of the explorer. It was this uninviting, uninhabited area which in the fall of 1858 appeared before Congress. It demanded not a slicing up of existing great territories, but a new grouping of lands taken out of the crest of the Rockies and in part from every one of the territories of the Central and Southwest, to this area, those who advocated the new project gave the name of the territory of Jefferson. Since the discovery of gold in California and the rush of the 49ers along the overland trails, there had always been bodies of prospectors scattered over the mountain region. Rumors of gold discoveries in the Desert Triangle had been heard early in the 50s, while the Panic of 1857 sent fresh bands of men to try their luck in the great game. In the year 1858, numerous parties were exploring the lands between the Arkansas and the Platte, and the arrival at Omaha on January 5th, 1859, of several quills filled with gold dust proved to the Missouri settlers that success had rewarded the prolonged search and started a new westward movement of large proportions to the Pikes Peak country. The city of Denver, named for the governor of Kansas Territory, became the settlement around which the Pikes Peak country grouped itself in the winter of 1858 to 1859. Boulder and Golden, Colorado City, and Pueblo became secondary centers, each situated as Denver was, at a point from which trade and travel branched from the great trails and entered the valleys leading to the mining camps. As early as June 1858, the forks of the South Platte and Cherry Creek were being examined by prospectors. As the summer and fall advanced, more adventurers appeared. The names of Montana, Highland, Auraria, and St. Charles came to designate settlements in the vicinity of the forks, and by November the inclusive name of Denver was heard. In a governmental way, the new camp of Denver was situated in Arapahoe County, Kansas, but Arapahoe County had never been organized and remained only a name until after the legislature of Kansas abolished it in February 1859. The settlers themselves saw from the start that the 500 miles of trail between the diggings and the territorial capital forbade protection from as well as interference by that government, and that their political salvation lay nearer home. They saw that 4 territorial governments were involved in the Pikes Peak country, and that the country was in itself an economic unit. It was this understanding which pressed upon Congress early in 1859 with a new territorial scheme, and which even earlier than this had produced a spontaneous political activity in the mountain camps. The beginnings of Colorado politics are to be found in the movement originating in Denver in November 1858 and culminating in the territorial organization of Jefferson in November 1859. The origin seems to have been in a typical early snowfall that drove the miners into their cabins in November 1858, and by enforcing idleness upon them, gave an opportunity for talking politics. Perhaps 200 miners were in Denver when the snowfall came, of whom some 35 attended a meeting on November 6th and determined to erect a new government for the Pikes Peak country. Just to think, wrote one of them, that within 2 weeks of the arrival of a few dozen Americans in a wilderness, they set to work to elect a delegate to the United States Congress and ask to be set apart as a new territory. But we are of a fast race and in a fast age and must prod along. To secure an attention to their demand, they chose one Hiram J. Graham to appear in their behalf at Washington and one A.J. Smith to represent them in the legislature of Kansas. The arrival of these men in Omaha seems at once to have confirmed the report of the discovery of placer gold in the western streams and to have announced the birth of a new center of population. 4 months after this first election, a new political whim struck Denver camp, and a set of local officers was chosen March 28, 1859 for Arapahoe County, Kansas, in spite of the fact that Kansas had on February 7, 1859 foreseen the coming emigration, reshaped Arapahoe, and cut out of it 5 new counties of Montana, Oro, El Paso, Fremont, and Broderick. The only significance of this March election for its officers seem never to have held power lies in the fact that nearly 800 votes were then cast. Already, the heavy migration of 1859 had begun to throw its thousands along the trails to Denver. Whether these thousands were 60 or 100, no one can tell today, but it is certain that after half or more of them had gone home in disgust, there remained in Jefferson nearly 30,000 settlers to reiterate the demand that Congress provide a government for them and to maintain the provisional territory for the interim. The mission of Hiram J. Graham to the second session of the 35th Congress failed to produce either an enabling or a territorial act. His arrival in Washington in January 1859 was followed by the appearance of his territorial scheme in the House, when A.J. Stevens introduced a bill for the erection of Jefferson Territory. Grow of Pennsylvania moved to amend the name to Osage, and when it was reported back from the Committee on Territories on February 16th, it was tabled without any serious discussion or opposition. The fate that had postponed the erection of new territories in 1858 continued to postpone in 1859, when Jefferson had been added to the list. Slavery debate forbade territorial legislation, and the single scheme, which had a real population behind it, was left without local or legal government, and was forced to find its way through 1859 until the next session of Congress might perhaps attend to business and provide for it a legal frame. The migration of 1859 multiplied the population of Denver many times and increased the need for orderly government, as well by the character as by the number of its inhabitants. A knowledge that no aid from Congress could be had for at least a year revived the local movement until it induced a group of pioneers to hold a caucus with William Larimer in the chair on April 11th to consider the local situation. As a result of this caucus, a call issued for a convention of representatives of the neighboring mining camps to meet in the same place 4 days later. And on April 15th, 1859, the camps of Fountain City, El Dorado, and El Paso, Arapahoe, Auraria, and Denver met through their delegates, being fully impressed with the belief from early and recent precedents of the power and benefits and duty of self-government, and feeling an imperative necessity for an immediate and adequate government for the large population now here and soon to be among us, and also believing that a territorial government is not such as our large and peculiarly situated population demands. The deliberations thus informally started ended in a formal call for a constitutional convention to meet in Denver on the first Monday in June for the purpose, as an address to the people stated, of framing a constitution for a new state of Jefferson. Shall it be, the address demanded, the government of the knife and the revolver? Or shall we unite in forming here, in our golden country, among the ravines and gulches of the Rocky Mountains and the fertile valleys of the Arkansas and the Platte, a new and independent state? With a generosity characteristic of the frontier, the convention determined the boundaries of the prospective state as the 102nd and 110th meridians of longitude and the 37th and 43rd parallels of latitude, an area including, in addition to the present state of Colorado, large portions of Utah and Nebraska, and nearly half of Wyoming. The arrival in Denver, a week after this convention, of William N. Byers was important in that it brought an active advocate of statehood into the field and produced on April 23rd the first number of the Rocky Mountain News. When the statehood convention, called on April 15th, met in Denver in June 6th, the time was inopportune for concluding the movement, for large numbers of the pioneers who had rushed out over the plains for Pike's Peak or bust were already on their disconsolate way back, busted. The first reputation of the diggings was based upon light and exaggerated discoveries of placer gold. When productive lodes came into view, they called for more capital and experience than most of the early prospectors possessed. The height of the gold boom was over by June, and the return migration made it somewhat doubtful whether any permanent population would be left in the country to need a state. So the convention met on June 6th, appointed some 8 drafting committees, and adjourned to await developments until August 1st. But by the 1st of August, a line had been drawn between the confident and the discouraged elements in the population. And for 6 days, the convention worked upon the question of statehood. As to permanency, there was by this time no doubt, but the body divided into 2 nearly equal groups, one advocating immediate statehood, the other shrinking from the heavy taxation incident to a state establishment, and so preferring a territorial government with a federal treasury to meet the bills. The body, too badly split to reach a conclusion itself, compromised by preparing the way for either development and leaving the choice to public vote. A state constitution was drawn up on one hand, while on the other was prepared a memorial to Congress praying for a territorial government, and both documents were submitted to a vote on September 5th, 1859, when the memorial was chosen instead of the Constitution. Upon October 3rd, another election was held pursuant to the memorial, and a delegate to Congress was chosen in the person of Beverly D. Williams, who was local agent of a new Leavenworth and Pikes Peak Express Company, which had run its first coach into Denver in May and whose zeal for mail contracts may have inspired some of his earnestness for congressional countenance.